Jamie might or might not. He and Amy are having dinner.
All right.
They just finished.
Before you start, Kevin, one quick question.
Yes.
Any idea at all?
So I'm going to start the recording again because I think people might want to hear this. When we get together, and I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be, first it's going to be in a very small group. And how we decide who comes into those small groups and how far apart we'll be spaced, I don't know. And I also know that there will not be a lot of singing because from everything that I'm reading, the 6-foot social distancing works when you're just talking to each other, especially if you have a mask on. But when you start singing, you project your stuff out 2 to 3 times as far as you do when you're talking, and it's in much smaller droplets. They talk about it being in the form of an aerosol, very small droplets that float in the air. Compared with when you're talking, they're bigger droplets that kind of drop to the ground. And so when you're singing and creating this aerosol effect, it goes out further and it lasts longer. And so
I'll have to play more organ stuff.
yes, I think that'll be true. I think there'll be a lot more instrumental music.
Or maybe have a cantor or something
Right.
that does singing on behalf of the people,
Right,
like the choirs used to do.
right. Or maybe I am so thankful we live in the Northern Hemisphere because I have a lot of friends who live in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere, and they're coming into winter right now. At least we're breaking out of this into summer.
Yeah.
And we see the nice weather coming along, but the people in the Southern Hemisphere are slinking into winter. So on top of everything else, they're going into their cold and dark season. So, maybe part of this might be an outside thing. I don't know. I really don't know. So that's why I don't want to get too definitive and hold out false hopes, only to have to pull them back at some other time in the future. So, but I do think we are gifted with some incredibly talented musical talent in our congregation.
Here, here.
Between Lee and Lynn, and I see David Barkey's just hopped in. And we've got
everyone.
We have this phenomenal instrument up in the choir loft. So I think in the last couple weeks, especially in the last week, all of a sudden, my heart has been aching to see you all again. I don't care if we sing or we don't sing, and I don't care how far apart we're spaced. I'm just going to be so thankful to see you all again, and to be in the same space. And even if we have to take shifts, we'll make it all work. So with that being said, let's pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for bringing us here this evening. We thank you for the technology that allows us to gather as the community of the church, brought around from different parts of our community. We thank you for the friendship and fellowship that we have experienced through this crazy time. We thank you that it has brought us together in different ways than we would have ever imagined possible prior to this. We thank you for patience and kindness. We thank you that nobody in our church has gotten sick yet. And we ask you to watch over and guide those who are isolated and alone, especially Bob and Boris, who are locked off in communities with very little contact with the outside world. Be with us tonight in our conversation. Be with us and help us understand that you are present with us every step of the way. And we ask this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
All right. Well, I'm going to try sharing my screen because, of course, you can't have a presentation like this without a PowerPoint presentation. And so we've started this service of benediction at the cathedral again, which we did it for 2 reasons. First off, it's part of the culture of the it's part of the Anglo-Catholic nature of the cathedral. I also get a sense that since we can't gather as the people of God and celebrate Holy Communion, that some sort of sacramental presence in our community is important at this time. And so I think what benediction allows us to do is to acknowledge the importance of the Eucharist, even though we can't celebrate it collectively, and acknowledge part of the heritage of the place. And it's a very beautiful, short, concise service of the church that, and as we'll see, goes back to the very roots of the church. So what I'd like to do sort of is show that what benediction is not just a standalone service. It's participating in a trajectory that has been in place since the beginning of the church. That as our understanding of the Eucharist, as our understanding of coming together as the people of God has expanded and matured over the millennia, this service has sort of has its roots in the very earliest of days, and it's not just some it's not just a pretty service. It's really connected to our faith in a really important sort of way. My slides are not very good. First, what I want to talk about a little bit is the concept of sacrament. The classical definition of sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. And so the sacraments of the church portray to us as the people of God how God's grace extends out to us. Now, as Anglicans, we are the recipients of two very different strains of the Christian church. We are recipients of the Reformed Church, which holds above all that we are saved through grace alone, but we're also recipients of the Catholic faith that has come down through the ages. And so we celebrate the 7 traditional sacraments of the church. The two primary ones being baptism and the Eucharist. Those two things, according to the 39 Articles, are necessary to the Christian life. And so when we talk about benediction, what we're talking about in one way is what is essential to the Christian life. Does anybody know what the other 5 are? Anybody want to shout them out?
Unction.
Unction, yeah.
Confirmation.
Yeah, confirmation.
Marriage.
Yeah.
Holy orders.
Holy orders.
Baptism.
Yeah, baptism.
Penance.
Penance, yes. Confession, reconciliation. Those are the 7 traditional sacraments of the Catholic Church. During the Protestant Reformation in England, the compromise that was made between the hardcore puritanical end of the spectrum and the more traditional Catholic end of the spectrum was that Eucharist and baptism are essential to the Christian life, and the other 5 sacraments help us in their means of grace to live our ordinary lives, our everyday lives. Confirmation is an adult affirmation of our baptismal vows. Matrimony is how 2 people come together and promise to help and support each other through the rest of their life. Unction is a recognition that our body and soul are intimately connected. Ordination, we understand that some people are called to lead Christian communities in ways that are unique to that calling. But when we're talking about the Eucharist, when we're talking about Holy Communion, we're talking about something that goes back to the very beginning of the Christian church. It goes back as far as, if we look into the New Testament, we see Paul talking about the Eucharist. Well, first we see the words of institution in John's Gospel. We go back to the very beginning of the Gospel tradition, where in John's Gospel, Jesus very intentionally lays out at the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, do this in remembrance of me. And it's not just a a nice thing for him to do. It's a way for us to know that God is present in our lives constantly, from the beginning of time down to where we're at. St. Paul talks about it specifically when he was talking to the Corinthian church. Remember that in the Corinthian church, they were in the midst of kind of strife. And part of it was that in Corinth, they were meeting in house churches. And there was started to become a division between the rich people who owned the houses and the poor people who were invited into the houses, and the rich people got to go into the nicer rooms and the poor people got to go back into the kitchen with the servants. And Paul said, no, when we come together to celebrate the Eucharist, we're all together in this. We're one community, one body of Christ. And he warned them that if we partake in the Eucharist unworthily, without reconciling us to our brothers and our sisters, that it's a perilous road to go down. And so we see in the very earliest times of the New Testament times that the concept of the Eucharist is foreshadowed, and then it's developed over time. I'm just going to try doing one thing. Oh yes, that's much nicer, isn't it? Okay. Justin Martyr was one of the early patristic fathers. He was one of the first original Christian apologetics, and he lived between 100 and 165. And he talked about the Eucharist in these terms. He said that they were ready to, they celebrated the Eucharist within homes, and they took it out of the homes to those who were shut in, to those who couldn't come. And so we find the tradition of the Eucharist being taken out to the sick after being celebrated within home churches, really as early as the 1st century of Christianity.
Kevin, what's a Christian apologetic?
Well, somebody who's advocating for the faith, not
Okay.
an apology in the sense that you're making an excuse for something you did wrong. Apologetics are advocates for the faith. So
Thank you.
He was an evangelist. He was one of the first evangelists, and his early writings, especially the Didache, give us a very clear understanding of what was going on in the early church in those very early days. And one of the things they did was gathered on a weekly basis, and they celebrated the Eucharist in their way and in their shape. Now, it comes out of the Jewish tradition. If anybody's ever been to a Shabbat service at a Jewish temple, you see where our history comes from. The bread, the wine, the blessing, the breaking, the reception, the distribution. It's all there in our Jewish roots. And so it started there. And so as early as 100 BC, we see the Eucharist being celebrated in home churches and then taken out to the sick so that people could receive it when they weren't available to come on Sundays. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, we see the beginning of the monastic movement, primarily in Africa and the Desert Fathers. If you've ever read, there's a great author, a great Christian author named Phyllis Tickle. She was an Episcopalian, and she writes about how in the Christian tradition, every 500 years or so, there's a great shift in thinking. And in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, we see the first shift taking place, which was the rise of monasticism. And it was sort of a response to, after 400 or 500 years, people perceived the church as becoming very institutionalized and very rule-bound. That's one thing the Roman Church was very good at, was making rules and promulgating rules and creating structure. And the monastic movement started shifting things back to the earliest sort of era of the Acts of the Apostles, where it was much more communally based, and how in those earliest days in the Acts of the Apostles, people took care of each other. The widows, the orphans were tended by the church. And the monastic movement sort of tried to get back to that. And then the kind of extreme end of the monastic movement were hermits who would go out into the desert and would pray in solitude, would live in solitude, dedicate themselves to lives of prayer. But one of the things that happened during that time was that that hermits would take part in Eucharist and then reserve sacraments in their hermitages, and they would have Eucharist, they would have blessed bread that they would partake in throughout the week or 2 or 3 weeks in between times that they were able to celebrate the Eucharist with other people. So it's at that point where we really see the beginning of the concept of reserved sacrament, of sacrament being set aside for people who couldn't be present during a regular celebration. And again, this is we're flying through about 2,000 years of Eucharistic theology in about 22 minutes, and so we're going very fast. And feel free to jump in and yell and ask questions also, because I know we're going fast. By the 7th and 8th century, we've seen the promulgation of Christianity out through the mainstream of the European continent. And as far as Lindisfarne, which is an island in Great Britain, which is really one of the great centers of the monastic tradition, and even by the 8th century, they had reserved the sacrament at their monastery so that people could come in and meditate in front or in the presence of the sacrament, even though it wasn't being celebrated on a Sunday. It was there and available. And what this also goes back to is, in our Anglican tradition, we're in line with the Orthodox, we're in line with the Romans, we're in line with the Lutherans, who will tell you that Jesus Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. Sometimes we don't agree. I like to say we agree in the what, we don't necessarily agree in the how. We agree that Jesus is present really, truly in the Eucharist, just as truly present as you and I are here sitting this evening listening to this, as truly as my desk is solid underneath me. Jesus is present in the Eucharist. What I like to also think about is what we receive from the Eastern Church, from the Orthodox Church. They don't really care about the how. They're very willing to say it's a mystery. We don't care how. In the West, we care a great deal about how. We care a great deal about process, and we'll get to that when we talk about Thomas Aquinas in a few minutes. But we see this. We see the Eucharist. We see the Eucharistic tradition spreading out through Europe, and an acknowledgement that in different forms, Jesus is present in the sacrament, in the real world. Pope Gregory VII was a forerunner to the Fourth Lateran Council, which at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1255, they really established the Western tradition of what we've come to understand as the theology of the Eucharist. At the Lateran Council, that was the first time that they said that people not only had to watch the Eucharist, to observe the Eucharist, but you had to go to communion once a year. They called it the Easter obligation. They established at the Fourth Lateran Council that you had to go to confession and communion once a year to be part of the broader Catholic Church. They also undergirded the notion of the real presence of Jesus, that it wasn't that it was a mysterious, real presence of God in our world, and that also up until that time, you saw in a lot of parts of Europe, people would come together in cathedrals and churches and watch the Mass take place, but they wouldn't partake in it so much. They saw, I said in my slide here, Eucharist, that the Lateran Council said that Eucharist as to celebrate it as a community and not as theater. And maybe that's a little bit judgmental, but it was that people would come together and just observe and not participate. And what at the Fourth Lateran Council, they said, no, that's not good enough. That that you had to participate in it to a minimal extent to be part of the Church Catholic. And again, what we're getting back to is that sense of real presence, the presence of Jesus Christ, truly present in our lives every day in a very real sense. And then along, right after the Lateran Council comes along Thomas Aquinas, who really takes up the concept of transubstantiation, which is still the official doctrine of the Catholic Church, which is that the body, the bread and the water are turned truly into the body and blood of Christ. And I think transubstantiation, we don't really accept that, or we don't acknowledge it in the Anglican tradition as rigidly as the Roman Church does. Again, it gets back to, I think transubstantiation is sort of a how. It's a process question. It's not the what, it's not the end game, it's a how. And in my mind, Thomas Aquinas, when he was talking about transubstantiation, was sort of talking about, he was using the highest and best of science as they knew it at the time. It would be us try to sort of explain the Eucharist in terms, if we decide, okay, we're going to talk about the Eucharist in terms of chaos theory or string theory, trying to use the highest and best of our science to explain this mystery. And that's what Aquinas was doing. And I think it was a noble effort. And I think anything that helps us understand the mysterious is a noble effort. I also think, go ahead.
But that's not, mysterious is not really science. If you want to say that this is science, that really isn't science. That's there's mystery and then there's science, and you can't say that that's science because that's mystery. And what worries me about that whole concept of the real presence is we are taught that if we are to go to heaven, it will only be because we become unified with Christ somehow, he in us and we in him. And if this is the Eucharist is an example of Christ in something else, that kind of gives a worrying concept of how we will ascend into heaven, perhaps, in the same way that Christ is present in the Eucharist, which is to say, mysteriously, and how did that work?
Well, in the hymns that can be sung at that time by Aquinas, it's, what the senses cannot fathom, faith must serve to compensate. And so I think that's where the element of faith comes in this whole thing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee. I agree.
Maybe instead of science,
I think
science will never be able to explain that. It's a faith thing. So
right.
Yeah, but even if you say it's a faith thing, my notion of that is to be basically unobservable, which is, well, okay. Maybe I should not interrupt anymore. Thank you.
No. John, I think you're on the right track. I think we have a desire to understand things. And so we build metaphors and we build models to try to understand the incomprehensible. And at every generation, we delve deeper into the incomprehensible. When I was in high school, there were neutrons and protons and electrons. And we understood the world in those terms. Now we know that there's quarks and the Bose-Hignon particles. We know that it's gone beyond that because our sort of understanding of the world has expanded. And I think that one of the things I find marvelous about science is that in some ways it's very humbling, because the more we know about science, the less we know about the world, because the world gets bigger and deeper. And so I'm thankful for science, but I also think that people strive to understand things, and so theology and religion sometimes strive to give us models so that we can sort of wrap our minds around the incomprehensible for a little bit, so that we can sort of try to understand what's going on. And we've gotten in trouble historically when science and religion try to say that they're talking about the same thing.
Yes, but I'm thinking of something more experiential, and electrons, neutrons, bosons, whatever. We're not part of experiencing those things. We're describing them in formulas and so forth, but we cannot be present in them to experience them. And if we are willing to say that our presence in heaven will not be experiential, it will be symbolic, but not experiential, then I kind of understand what we're trying to say here. But I don't know whether I'm being very clear. In fact, I'm maybe not being clear to myself.
No, I think you are, and I think it brings us full circle back around Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was trying to use the highest and best knowledge of the day to try to wrap his mind around the mystery of God. And I think that we all still strive to do that to this day. I don't think anything that he said was wrong. I think he was trying to help us, help the people of that time, and help us. He's still one of the great fathers of the church, understand the nature of God, which is, mind-blowing. It is incomprehensible. So all we can hope to have is a little glimpse of it from time to time.
Okay.
So John, you're not right. You are right in line with Aquinas, John. So
I agree with everything you say.
Yeah, right.
I wish my wife would. So anyway, we're skipping really quickly. We're skipping really quickly through the history of the Christian church. It's not a very long hop from Aquinas in the 12th, 13th century into the Reformation, where we see kind of abuses of the church, twisting things around. And in the Anglican Church, we had Thomas Cranmer during the time of the English Reformation, in the 39 articles talking about the difference between the Roman Church and the English Church. And Article 28 speaks specifically about the Eucharist. And in Anglicanism, you'll notice in the second paragraph that he kind of denounces transubstantiation. And again, he's not denouncing the what. He's saying we don't need to understand the how. That when we get too deep into the how, when we get too deep in trying to understand the nature of God, it becomes sort of silly, sort of superstitious in some ways. And at that time, you see the last sacrament, or the last sentence is, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was not Christ's ordinance reserved, carried about, lifted up, or worshipped. And I think at that time in the church, you saw, especially in different parts of Europe, different festivals where the sacrament was taken about, paraded around in neighborhoods and around the bounds of the parishes, and the Reforming Fathers did not countenance that. But I don't think, as we get a few more steps down the road, that it is mutually exclusive with the service of benediction. Finally, by the Middle Ages, or by the 18th and 19th century, we see the church striving to get back to a certain sense of of understanding the mysteriousness of what was going on. And so we see benediction, that service, especially in the Roman Church and in high church Anglican churches, starting to take a prominent role again. And again, what it is people striving to be in the real presence of God in their everyday life. And so so that's when it really took hold again, especially in Northern Europe, especially in the parts of Europe with the where
Somebody's got a radio that's
Yeah,
kind of
something.
crowding you out there a little bit, or something.
that's all right. So anyway, that gets us to where we're sort of at right now. We've sort of gotten to a place where we've come back and we've tried to, in this time when we're not celebrating the Eucharist with each other, having a Eucharistic presence in our worship life at the cathedral brings us back to benediction, which has been part of our tradition there, and which is simply, I think, it's the acknowledgement that in the Eucharist, God is present in our world in a real and tangible way, and that's worthy of acknowledgement. And when we talk about Eucharistic adoration, we're not worshiping the sacrament. We're not, it's not an idolistic practice. It's simply our acknowledgement that we want to sit in the presence of God and take in the grace that comes along with that to charge us up to go back out into the world that we're called to go back out into, especially in this whacked out, crazy time. Where it's so easy to think that God has abandoned us, and that's just not true. It's absolutely not true.
Father Kevin, could you maybe mute everybody? It really is getting really hard to hear you.
I'll give it a shot.
Karen, your picture's not on.
Yep, that was done for a reason.
Okay.
I should have not put mine on, Karen.
Yeah. So if everybody could just mute their microphones just for there we go. Whoever's so like I said, we just cruised through almost 2,000 years of Eucharistic theology in a very simple surface sort of way in about 30 minutes. And so I guess I'd be curious to hear if people have thoughts, questions. The reestablishment of benediction at the cathedral in the middle of this thing. It's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and it just seemed like a natural thing to do at this time when we weren't celebrating the Eucharist on a regular basis, but to have the acknowledgement that God is present with us in this time, to me, just seemed really important.
I guess I have a question as to why couldn't there be a Eucharist, even though it would be you and a server, but we would still see the process.
I missed the prayers too.
I can sell it both ways. I think we could do it, and it would be meaningful in some people. I think that the celebration of the Eucharist is a communal act, and
Not theater.
it's right, and it's the action of the priest and the congregation in concert, asking God to come truly present into our midst. And so if we had 2 or 3 people there, it would be efficacious, it would be the real thing, but it wouldn't be the richness and the fullness of the congregation celebrating the Eucharist. And I've been told I can't do it. So,
Bishop.
that sort of,
Actually, Kevin, I like the benedict. I don't know what it adds. It adds, maybe I'm one of those Episcopalians that is just comforted by the whole ceremony and by the routine, and it's very comforting to me. But I never realized what a benediction was before, but I am, helped is the wrong word. I'm comforted. I'm something by it. And I thank you for adding it.
well, I have never gone this long in my life without celebrating the Eucharist. And it's a huge
Likewise.
hole. It's a massive hole in my spirit. And so, like I say, I can sell it both ways, and I don't have a choice. But I think the bishop was very gracious in allowing us to do this, to offer it back out into the world. So I'm happy we're able to do it.
National Cathedral had to celebrate Eucharist, priest, and acolyte. And so forth.
Yes, they do. And it's very nice.
Bishop.
Kevin,
Yes.
I have a question. My memory of this service, I think it was called the Adoration of the Sacraments. Is that so? Do I remember correctly?
What did you call it?
The Adoration of the Sacraments.
Yes, because adoration is different than worship. We want to make sure that we're clear that we're not worshiping the sacrament. It's an act of adoration. It's an act of love and acknowledging. If we were actually worshiping that host, which is, I think, what some of our Protestant brothers and sisters think we might be doing, that would be idolatry. We're not worshiping the host. We're not worshiping the sacrament. It's a practice of adoration. It's a practice of profound prayer and love. And so we're sitting in the presence of God, professing our love for God and acknowledging God's love for us. So adoration is different than worship. So I think that's correct. It is adoration. Eucharistic adoration that's absolutely correct.
Good.
Well, the first service like this, it was one of the first I knew in the Episcopal Church was this, and I was very, very moved by it. The problem, if I get my head thinking instead of feeling like I'm worshiping, I get a little troubled about being blessed by the host.
We're not being blessed by the host. We're being blessed by the fact that Jesus is present in our lives. And it's the same thing as the Eucharist. I mean, there's no greater blessing in the world than the Eucharist. And so we're sort of acknowledging that. But I agree with you. And you'll hear people saying cynically that Catholics, worship Mary. They worship the saints.
Right.
That it's that's idolatry. But that's because they don't understand the difference between worship and adoration. That we see the lives of the saints as being worthy of their examples of how to live our lives. And we see in the Eucharist, not only, it's the grace that's conferred in the sacrament, but it's also acknowledgement that God is present in our world. We've not been abandoned. It's a screwed up world. And God walks with us through all this chaos. And so I think that's what benediction speaks to also, in a way that simply evening prayer or even song or morning prayer doesn't speak to. And so we're blessed. We have our feet in both camps. We have our feet in that Protestant Reformed camp, and we also have our feet in the rich tradition of the Catholic faith.
The only benediction I have ever attended was in the Catholic Church. I didn't know anything about it at the time, and I still don't.
Well,
I understand.
when we come back, we're not going to stop this.
Good.
You know,
I have to say this. I mean, about, you know, I've never dragged myself out on a Sunday night to get down to church for evening prayer. I may actually do it. I'm so enjoying the service itself online. So when we are able to celebrate again, I may actually drag my tail out of this house and come down and see it. I'm that impressed by it. And Kevin, you said something about we have our 1 foot in both camps. I grew up with a lot of Presbyterian friends, and they used to call me a middle of the roader. I had realized then what I know now. I'm not in the middle of the road. I share the best of both worlds.
absolutely.
And that's awesome.
It's the concept of the via media. That's what differentiates us from the Catholic Church, and also differentiates us from the hardcore Protestant world, this middle ground, that we can accept the best of both worlds. And it's not a compromise, it's a blessing.
Yes.
That we can experience the best of both of those traditions. So, you know, one body, many parts. I say that all the time whenever I'm shaking my head at some goofy thing from some other, that one body, many parts, you know.
I hope that when we do it in church, that we can have the congregation singing the usual parts, because it's wonderful to.
We will.
Well, if there aren't that many of us, Miriam, we can probably sit far enough apart.
That's for sure.
We'll do it at some point. I think that's going to be a function of the vaccine. You know,
Yeah.
when we have the vaccine, we'll be singing again.
Can't we sing with masks?
We'll figure something out. We'll have some form of music, some instrumental, some soloist, but it's just going to be different for a little bit. And so
I actually just ordered some face masks. I saw an ad online, and I ordered, I don't know, 5 face masks for $38. I think I'd rather wear that than an actual mask, with all due respect to Carroll Ketter, because half the time it doesn't stay behind my ear.
well,
Well,
I wear one of Carol's masks all the time. I get compliments on it all the time. People ask me
Oh,
where
yeah.
I got it. So
yes.
Is it a Mickey Mouse one?
no, mine is like purple. It's like it looks, well, it was a good Lenten mask. I probably need an Easter mask now. So we
might sound a little funny.
Yeah, we build this kind of Dean's Forum as kind of Cathedral Institute light. I don't want to take up people's whole night. One of the goals I hope is that people think about things, that maybe this gets your wheels turning about something you haven't thought about before, and that we can talk about later. Next week, I'm hoping we're going to have Jeff Waring with us and maybe Amy Hudson, and we're going to talk about, they're both scientists, and we're going to talk about a whole variety of things on these Wednesday night things, but to talk about the science behind vaccines, and they can explain to us in much more comprehensible terms what's going on with the science behind it. And then after that, we're going to start a 5 to 7 week series on the sacraments, taking one sacrament every night.
Oh, cool.
And then
That'll be nice.
And then just sort of digesting it at an easier pace.
Kevin, thank you for this, because like a lot of other people, I've missed hearing you talk about these things. I really have.
Well, I miss you all. I really do. I mean, I didn't sign up for this gig to sit in the office and talk into a computer. It just, it's draining. But when I see all your faces, that's so heartening. And I know that the community is still there.
You may be the first person ever to say that they were happy to see my face.
I don't think that's
Benny
true.
Lane said that once or twice.
David, did you have a question?
Well, I just have some thoughts that came to mind about benediction. And in reflecting on the history that we saw tonight and things people have said, at baptism, we received the grace of faith. And so baptism, I think, affords us with many graces, one of which is an obligation to witness and to live the Christian life through acts of mercy and love and compassion and thanksgiving. And those are all embodied in what worship is. And that is a blessing. So I see benediction, the act of adoration, as a fruit of faith. So
Yes.
given the grace of faith, the fruit of baptism, the fruit of our faith are the things we do. And adoration is a fruit of our faith. It's an act of faith. And most importantly, it's an act of witness to one another who are there, be it through technology on both sides of the camera or in the room. So it's the corporate witness to one another that this we believe, but also to the world. So those are just my thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
About adoration, what adoration is, a lot of different ways of looking at it.
Yeah.
But it's a fruit of our faith.
If there's one thing to take away from tonight, it's the difference between worship and adoration. We worship God. We worship Jesus Christ. We worship the Holy Spirit. We adore the sacraments. And we can adore baptism and holy orders and marriage and everything in the same way as we can adore the Eucharist. It's just sitting in their presence and absorbing the grace that flows from them, which is different than worshiping something in an idolistic way.
Adoration is just a derivative of the word adore, which to my mind, another way of saying emphatic love.
Sure.
That works.
Or the monstrance, the vessel that we show the sacrament in, monstrance comes from the same Latin root word as demonstrate. So we're demonstrating to the world what our faith is about. It's not us worshiping that thing. It's the sacrament demonstrating to the world the grace of God. So
Is there a story behind the design of the monstrance? I mean, it's a very different design than anything I've seen.
I don't know. That would be a good question for Father Pay sometime.
Okay.
He's good at, he knows those sort of historical, archaic sort of things.
How's he doing?
He's doing okay. I was just talking this afternoon. The originally, as things progressed, as churches, well, this is good for a whole nother night, so I'm not going to go down that road.
Okay, save it.
The monstrance is again, it's the end result of 2,000 or 1,500 years of trajectory, and it's how we acknowledge the presence of God in our lives, and it's the development of our Eucharistic piety through 15 millennia or 15 centuries of thought. So it's just a vessel. It's just a thing. It's a thing like a chalice or a paten is.
It's a special vessel to show the specialness of what it's holding. Kind of like one time many years ago, I saw somebody put communion that was not consumed in a plastic bag and twirl it around, and that's not good.
No.
A sign of where you're putting our Lord, especially to be seen. So it's just that we're putting it in the nicest thing that human hands can make.
Right. That's an excellent way of putting it. But it's also a thing.
Yeah, but it's better in a plastic bag.
Oh yeah.
Or just put it up there and say, here it is.
Right. The way we
frame. It's like putting a frame on a picture.
Right. Watch the way we treat things during worship. We treat things respectfully to acknowledge what we're doing. There's no way we can fully acknowledge the fullness. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes when I'm standing behind that altar saying the words that I do, it scares the crap out of me. Because if you really think about the words we're saying and what we're asking God to do, it's terrifying.
I do it.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, God is love. And so I'm sure that God's intention is not to scare the crap out of his people. But we should
Some people.
always be very aware of what we're doing, you know, and how we're doing it, and the way that we do it in a respectful fashion. And Lee is exactly right. It's a beautiful thing. It's the highest and best of kind of an art form. So yeah, thank you. That was very good.
In the
We got time for about one more question if somebody's got a question.
Well, it's not just my usual disturbance. But speaking of a disturbing thing, when I was a very young person, I was stunned to learn about a Greek mythology of the god of wine going to the underworld and rescuing, was it Eurydice or somebody, and returning from the underworld and saving everybody and so forth. You mentioned when you began that there's a lot of Jewish tradition in the Christian principles,
right.
But it's kind of scares me that there's also some Greek tradition, and much of what we understand of heaven and hell seems to be derived very strongly from the Greek tradition, or at least from that tradition that says, when we die, we're going to consort with 21 virgins and so forth, and that kind of thing.
You should be so lucky.
Lynn.
That should sound like Al-Qaeda.
It seems to me that if we ever make it into heaven, we will be, it will be a much more abstract thing, right, that we may not be as conscious or as subject to our own people as we be. That may be a greater abstraction than we think about, such as the abstraction of Jesus being present, body and blood, in the host during communion. That kind of thing.
John, you think too much.
No, no, but John, I think it gets back to at the end of the day, religion is a sacred metaphor. Religion is a way for human beings to try to comprehend the incomprehensible. And I think you're absolutely right. We build these constructs to try to understand the incomprehensible. I really doubt when we get to heaven we're going to get wings and there's going to be golden roads. It's going to be something that we can't even comprehend right now. So we build these constructs in the meantime to help wrap our minds around. And Christians do it in one way, and Jewish people do it in another way, and Muslims do it another way. We build these constructs to understand the nature of God. And the nature.
John, I don't think anything can be more abstract than what I learned in confirmation, and that is hell is the absence of God and heaven is the presence of God. And I cannot imagine, I really can't imagine what it would be like to be in the presence of God. I mean, I know I'm in the presence in the Eucharist, I know those things, but to actually be at some level of whatever, consciousness, if you will, or that has to be, talk about an abstract concept. That to me is going to be literally mind-blowing. I don't know.
Well, maybe after we get done with the sacraments, let's talk about the last things. That might be a fascinating couple of nights to talk about what we believe about heaven and hell and the afterlife, and especially in these times, in these very times when death is so prevalent in our society, and people are scared.
I absolutely agree with that position, because I find it difficult to conceive of the concept of hell that I learned when I was in the Catholic Church, of eternal burning in the fires of hell.
Right.
1 second of which would be like 10 years of pain for me. And, I really think that a loving God not possibly put us into that situation. That worst, we would be absented from his presence.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Well, I
was
think
it,
that's
was it C.S. Lewis, the one that said, you believe in hell, but you don't have to believe anybody's there?
I think it was probably a few people who should be, but
Yeah.
but anyway,
Yeah.
Debbie Hillman used to give the Sunday school classes when she was Debbie Hall, and she said that she believes in such a loving God that ultimately, over time, whatever that is, hell will be empty.
yeah.
And that, to me, is very
was going there.
Well, let's do that. Let's throw that in the queue, or maybe we can do that at a Cathedral Institute and have some highfalutin theologian come in and try to explain it to us. But anyway, I want to leave you with the words of Mr. Rogers. If you haven't seen the movie A Day in the Neighborhood, look at it. It's phenomenal. It's a story about a relationship between. It's a real story about the relationship between Fred Rogers and a reporter from Esquire magazine, and how this relationship changed this reporter's life. And at the end of the movie, the reporter's dad is dying of cancer, and Fred Rogers shows up at this guy's house, at the dad's house, and the whole family sitting around his deathbed, and they're just stone silent. And Fred Rogers looks up and he says, death is hard for us to talk about, but death is what makes us human, and what makes us human is mentionable, and if it's mentionable, it's manageable. That when we can talk about things and work things through, we can understand them, and we can come to a place where we're not afraid of them. For me, maybe it was just a moment in time. Maybe I had too much bourbon before I watched the movie. I don't know. But it was just it was a really profound thought that what makes us human is mentionable, and if it's mentionable, it's manageable. And so, in this time of a whole lot of things that scare the crap out of us, let's make sure we're talking to each other and giving other people the opportunity to talk to us and lighten the burden and not be so afraid of things. So anyway, thank you for joining us tonight. And
thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
What's going on tomorrow night?
Tomorrow night is Cathedral Institute, and it's I'm drawing a blank. You'll have to go back and look on the Friday evening, and it's all right there. But we'll see you here tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry I was late.
All right.
Bye, y'all.
Hey, Kevin, can I ask you a technical question?
Bye.